Kia ora, I'm Erin Jodoa. Welcome to my channel. Today is the day that the Acorn Fiction Prize is announced, along with a whole bunch of other literary awards actually, but the Acorn is the one that I'm interested in because it's the one that I decided I would read the shortlist for. I failed because I need to learn. I cannot take on lots of stuff in April. I need to learn this. So next year, when I announce that I'm doing Camp NaNoWriMo in April, please send me messages going, no you're not, you idiot, no, not allowed, because like, I overcommit and I always fail Camp Nano goals. No matter what goal I set, I always fail Camp Nano in April, and it just doesn't matter what I'm trying to do, it's always too much. And I think it's just because we have such a cluster of holidays, so I'm always going away and it just gets into the middle of everything else that I'm trying to do. So taking on challenges in April, foolish, I should stop immediately. So anyway, in amongst attempting and failing to do Camp Nano and having lots of public holidays, I was also trying to read 4 novels, which is quite a lot for me. I usually only read about 2 in a month. So anyway, I tried to read all 4 and I didn't make it. I completed Better the Blood and I completed the XMen Carnival, and then I got to about halfway through Kawaii for Such a Time as This and realised I just wasn't going to make it. So at about 186 pages I think I got up to, I decided to put this one down and to pick up Mrs. Jewel and the Wreck of the General Grant, so at least there was a chance I could have read 3 1/2, as it is I read 2 2/2, which makes doing a predictions video kind of pointless. But then I thought what I could do is try and be controlled and ignore that I know how these two end and actually just talk about the opening 100 pages of each of these 4 books. Because if you think about it, a lot of people, if they're not completely hooked and passionate about a book by page 100, they won't finish it. So, I mean, obviously a lot of us will power through it, but you know, for a lot of people it's the first 100 pages that really count. So I think I can talk about the first 100 pages, or at least I'm going to talk about the first 100 pages, and we'll see if I actually keep this footage. Okay, so we're going to start off with Better the Blood. This is a thriller about a serial killer who is choosing his victims specifically as vengeance for an event that happened generations earlier during New Zealand's very violent colonial period. The investigating officer for this is Māori, and so she has a little bit of a conflict between some of the racist actions of the New Zealand police and her own cultural identity and needs. I'm not allowed to talk about the end. I do have a couple of post-its. Unfortunately, these are mostly for things where I was like, grumbly, but I think it's always worth noting, if I pick up something as a nitpicky, that's not how it would work thing, the fact that I'm a scientist should always be considered there. Like, it takes a little bit more for me to be convinced by something. Obviously if it's sci-fi fantasy, I can, you know, put aside some amount of disbelief and just kind of go with the flow, but when something is supposed to be, you know, real world and evidence-based, if there's something weird about the methodology, I'm going to notice immediately. So there was something in the first 100 pages I'm allowed to talk about, where I was just like, oh, that's not how you do that. And I think probably other people would notice it as well. I don't think it's a sufficiently scientific niggly bit that no one else would notice it. However, I think if it was done, you know, in a more correct, from my perspective, way, in terms of like the methodology and how they handled this evidence, I don't think it would have made any difference to the plot or characterization, and therefore to me it's a bad thing. But it also means that it kind of doesn't matter, right? Like the way that they figured out this thing isn't important. For me it was just like a no, that's not how that would work kind of thing. So I think it's ignorable, but maybe only just. So yes, anyway, apart from that one little niggly bit, in terms of the first 100 pages, page turner. Next up we have Kawaii, For Such a Time as This. My apologies if I mispronounced the title there. This is set prior to the arrival of Europeans to New Zealand and starts off with a bang. It is quite a violent story, at least so far. I've only read about half. The opening scene of this is a boy of, I believe, 12 years old who regains consciousness on a battlefield surrounded by his fallen family, and he has to lie still and hope he isn't discovered whilst the victors of this battle comb the battlefield, butchering his family members for the pot. And then he escapes and runs off, and it talks about the following years where he goes on to raise his son to be a warrior and specifically to get vengeance for the death of his grandfathers in that battle. So it's very violent constantly. There's not a lot of break in between the acts of violence that we see, both with battles and with the main character being trained to become a warrior. There are, yes, moments which are not violent, but they are quite short, and unfortunately I find child protagonists extremely annoying. So for me, we've got a child protagonist which I just can't like. Like, children protagonists, I'm just like, do as you were told, you little shit. You know, so, you know, there's a scene here, for example, where, I don't know if it's in the first 100 pages, but it's early on, the main character eats karaka berries. These are poisonous if you eat them straight off the tree, but if you rinse them, I think you can boil them. I think there are a few different things you can do. You can eat them after you've done stuff to them, but he eats some straight off the tree, and some other people notice and are like, whoa, whoa, you can't eat those, and he's like, oh, tell me what to do, and he gets very, very sick. And I read that and I'm just like, you were told. You know, like, it's very hard for me to like a character who does childish things even though they're a child. So it's very hard for me to like the main character, which of course means it's hard for me to care. And while I'm reading this, I worry that because it started off at this very heightened danger sort of situation on this battlefield, and then we have a lot of ongoing violent events with this young boy, you know, being beaten and subjected to various hardships in the course of his warrior training. It feels like you're always on this like, oh no, kind of level, and you don't get to come down very much or for very long. And it makes me worry that as the story goes on and as he ages, like, how much more tense can it get? You know, like, if the stakes are already violence, murder, cannibalism, where do you go from there? So I am a little concerned at this point that there's no tension. It doesn't feel like there are big stakes. Partly because I can't bring myself to like a child character, and that's totally my fault, but also because we started off at such a heightened oh my god moment that I don't know I can go much higher than that in terms of the anticipation and stress whilst reading, and that has me a little bit worried. However, it's super interesting. I think this is quite possibly gonna win the prize just because it's really unusual. I have never read a book like this, and it's super well researched, which, you know, kudos. However, I read this and I feel like I am being given information in the form of a narrative rather than I am reading a story that has lots of interesting details. It is very research and information forward, and I don't know that that's really my jam. It's interesting information, I've learned stuff, I am interested, cool, but I don't like being aware that I am learning when I am reading a work of fiction. So I think it's very probable that this will win because it's unusual, because it's confronting, and it's really well researched. Like, these are all great things, but I think for me personally, it's not my winner. I have only got halfway through this. I will be finishing it. I am enjoying it. I don't see it being my favourite of the four when I have read the end of it. I can't really make a call yet, obviously. Don't know what this was. Next we have the XMen Carnival. This is narrated by a bird who is found struggling to survive after being kicked out of the nest when he is still like blind and featherless, and he's brought inside by a human who raises him, and he starts mimicking noises that he hears. And there's a thing that he says all the time. I think he says it pretty early on. In his narration he says, I didn't trust him, I was right not to trust him, in reference to the husband of the woman who saves him. Now this, in addition to the fact that it says on the back that there is domestic violence going on, meant that I spent the entire book, or at least, you know, well, yes, the entire book, but yes, I was convinced in the first 100 pages that the bird talking was going to save her from domestic violence. I was like, surely, because he mimics all of this stuff, and he mimics things that he's only ever heard once, and I was convinced that he was going to say something super incriminating that would make people pay attention and realise that the human who's raised him is in trouble and help her escape that situation. I'm not going to say whether or not that was correct, but that was what I was convinced by. So there was this really strong foreshadowing that I picked up really early on in the book, and because of that, it was again one of these like big patients, like what's going to happen, oh my god, because there was all of this set up for something's going to happen. The other thing I thought that was interesting about this is that this magpie is allowed to come and go from the house as he pleases, and so he still has contact with the magpie flock that lives on the farm, and he knows who his family are. And so he has this combined story, not combined, that's completely the wrong word, don't know where I was going with that. He has a second story where there's like his little story of him and his relationship with the other magpies, and kind of like his identity as a magpie, and then his separate relationship with the humans and what's going on with them. And I thought that was quite good, that he wasn't just you know, instantly a pet and no longer a wild animal and had no idea of where he came from. I really enjoyed this one, and I thought it was really well done. I don't think it's groundbreaking though. It was just like a good story, well told, all those good things, but it's not like, oh my god, I've never read a story like it before either. And lastly, we have Mrs. Jill and the Wreck of the General Grant. As the title suggests, this is about a shipwreck. Whew. And oh my goodness, I'm quite invested in this one. The ship wrecks very early on in the book, like I think like chapter 1 or 2, so not a big spoiler, I mean it's in the title. And Mrs. Jill is the only woman to survive the wreck. So she and 14 men survive, and this is the story of how they survived and what's going to happen next. And I think that's why I keep turning the pages, is because that's a really hard thing to kind of anticipate. Like, what happens? So many different things could happen with a shipwreck. So I'm quite invested, particularly because we learn pretty much right off the bat that she thinks she's pregnant. And so when the ship goes down, and obviously people get injured and, you know, things, she initially is quite worried that she might have lost the baby during the wreck itself, and then as they find an island and, you know, try and set up a camp and try and figure out what they're going to do next, she, in addition to being the only woman and being very vulnerable as well as being considered a burden to the men, she's also aware that she's pregnant. She hasn't told her husband this yet, and she is very aware that she might lose the baby. And then there's, you know, as the reader, you're starting to worry about, like, well, if she doesn't lose it, like, cool, but then are you going to give birth on a deserted island with no access to even relatively primitive medical care that was available during the gold rush period? Like, holy crap. So it's quite tense for that reason, and that's really engaging my interest. And there's also tensions between herself and her husband, because they are newly married when the ship goes down, and so they've gone from, you know, the super sweet honeymoon period to, holy crap, this is the ultimate challenge for our marriage. And yeah, like, I'm interested about how that's going to play out, how the pregnancy is going to play out, and how that's going to affect her interactions with the other men. There's a man who has also survived the wreck, who we know from the get-go is a person who showed romantic interest in her prior to her meeting her husband. So it's like, well, what is he going to get up to? There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And there's also you know, the individual stresses from the individual stresses of the individuals. Oh my god, talking hard. The other men each obviously have their own individual struggles, whether that's, you know, financial concerns because their gold went down with the ship and what are they going to do when they're rescued, or maybe their families went down with the ship and how are they handling that now, and that kind of things. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on that's got me really engaged. So I'm actually really enjoying this one. So, now, with all of this said, I'm sure I've been talking for quite a while now, I think, based on how I'm feeling about the two that I haven't finished yet, and how I felt about the two that I have, what are my picks? So, I think I've already said, I think this could win, just because it's super well researched, it is well written, and it's unusual. It has a really strong New Zealand focus, which New Zealand publishers do like. Personally, it's not really my cup of tea. Like, I do find it interesting because I haven't read something like it, but it's not necessarily a fun read, and the child protagonist is quite a struggle for me personally. So whilst I would be far from surprised if this won, for me this is my number 4, at least as it currently stands as half unread. Next up, I think these are all really close. Like, I mean, I haven't finished this one, but these are really close. Like, I could not put these down. And then we have the pre-acknowledged bias that I know the author for this one, so I'm like, well, it has to be this one. But oh my god, this is actually really tricky and I didn't think about it in advance. I just started filming. Okay. This is also tricky because I know how these two end, I don't know how this one ends. So I'm trying to put aside the satisfaction value from the ends of these and just try and think about the reading experience. So this one did have those couple of things where I was like, in terms of how the evidence was handled in the case. Oh my god, this is actually really hard. I needed to have thought about this in advance. Oh my god. Okay, I think I'm gonna say this is my number 3. Honestly, these two are kind of equal, actually. So far, yeah, I think this is my number 1. Sorry, Catherine, but I do think that is my order. I think in terms of likelihood of winning, I think our top 2 are going to be these 2. Because I think people are going to be praising the magpie narration, and it is very well written, and this one because the content is interesting. I don't think it's been done before, and it's super well researched, and I think it'll totally get props for that. And I think people other than me probably won't have a problem with the child protagonist. So these are my 2 expected winners, also based on like my general knowledge of current sales and stuff. Also, just a random observation, these 2 books both deal closely with Māori culture. One is contemporary, one is historical, and they present 2 incredibly different representations of Māori culture. In one, there's a huge emphasis on vengeance, and the other, yes, the story is about vengeance. It is like vengeance killings is what the serial killer in this is doing, but the community are not in support of that, and they have this very like, oh no, lost sheep, we need to find you, love, forgiveness, vengeance is not the way, no to violence sort of response. And I think if you knew nothing about New Zealand history or Māori culture and you read these 2 books one after the other, you'd be very confused. But that was not a comment on the books or the stories, it was just kind of an interesting observation that these are both about the same culture but are very, very different. It's also worth noting that this is, as I said, historical. This refers to historical events, but they're actually fictional historical events, and the iwi or tribe that is at the centre of this and their sacred mountain is all fictional. So what I actually liked about this is that it has used sort of an example of things that could have happened and did happen in certain areas, but the specific example that's used is fictional, so it's not taking advantage of or dramatising or in any way misrepresenting true historical facts or making profit off historical deaths. So actually, like, props for that. However, the author of this book is talking about his ancestors, his iwi, and my understanding is that he has spoken to the elders and the story keepers of his tribe or iwi, and has done this in a respectful manner that's not going to you know, cause upset or be disrespectful to ancestors. So in either case, like, props, done correctly, but also done in completely different ways, and food for thought for those of us who are thinking about writing historical works or works which talk about Indigenous populations. Okay, I think that's everything. I will recharge my batteries and I'll see you after the winner has been announced. It's now Friday. I didn't film my initial reaction to the winner because I didn't find out who it was until I had already entered pajamas mode, and we are not sharing that on the internet. So my very not candid reaction to the winner of this year's Acorn Fiction Prize is, hooray, Catherine Chidgey with the XMen Carnival. Very well deserved, not at all surprised, very happy. As for my rankings, obviously I still have to finish 2 books. At the moment, Mrs. Jewel and the Wreck of the General Grant is still my personal winner. I have read a little bit more than when I last spoke to you, and I am very engaged, like, oh my god. So, I mean, if I'm that invested, it's going to be my top, right? However, I will get to the end of that as well as Kawaii for such a time as this, and when I've read them I'll give you a very brief update on what my personal final ranking for those 4 books is. I'm aware that this is not the ideal way for this to have gone. Surely I should have completed the reading before the announcement, but you know, 'tis life, and I see no point in trying to make it seem more glamorous than it is. Anyway, that's it for this video. I have to run off and do exciting things, which I'll tell you about next week, and I think that's us. So, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave it a like. If you've read any of these books, do let me know down in the comments, know which one was your favourite. If you haven't already, maybe consider hitting subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!